The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
Good evening. Mark Johnson will be away for the next couple of weeks. I'm Jean McNeil. Most Americans don't know very much about Australia, except that it's called the land down under and has a lot of cute koalas and kangaroos. But in reality, modern-day Australia finds itself in a fascinating situation, both economically and politically. Politically, it is a Western-style government whose closest geographic ties are to the nations of the Far East. Economically, it is a land long dominated by the agriculture of the vast outback, but now increasingly coming under the influence of the industrialized cities of Sydney and Melbourne. As that influence grows, Australia is playing a bigger and bigger role in the world economy and a bigger and bigger role in the balance of trade in the United States, both as a consumer and as a competitor. We'll explore that relationship tonight in an interview with a top Australian diplomat that was taped on May 9th. John Melvish is the Australian Consul General in San Francisco. He is a career Foreign Service officer who has served, among other places, in Korea and in Singapore. Currently, he is responsible for overseeing Australia's interest in the Pacific Northwest. On the day of the announcement of the Russian Olympic boycott, Mark Johnson asked Melvish about his government's stand on that issue.
I haven't had a chance to find out what our government says, but there's no question that Australia is aligned to the United States. This was said very firmly and strongly by our Prime Minister, Mr. Hawke. And also when the Russians went into Afghanistan, we were stronger, I think, than the United States in protesting about this. But since Mr. Hawke, who is our new Prime Minister, has taken up office, he says, although we have no sort of delusions about this, what the Soviets stand for, it's still a fact of life that we must deal with them, and this must be done. So I would guess that the Australian government's position is that they are very sorry that the Russians are not going to the Olympic Games. But I'm only guessing, I'm only basing my remarks on what our Prime Minister has said.
It's being said today fairly strongly from a number of quarters that this is likely retaliation for the U.S. not participating in 1980. Does that seem likely?
Well, I've got no first-hand knowledge because this presupposes you know something about Russian thinking. And I was at a conference recently here in the United States where everybody said, who was in a position to know, what a tough problem it was working out how the Russians came to decisions.
In the largest possible context, is this bad for the world community to have, in a way, politicized what is essentially supposed to be at least a non-political event?
Yes, I'm sure it's bad, because I keep on going back to what our Prime Minister says, you know, we must live and learn to work with each other, and this was one of the themes that came out very strongly in this Northern California World Affairs Council. So anything that means moving away from that, I'm sure, is bad.
I'm not sure that a lot of Americans, people in this country, would know very much about your Prime Minister. What I have read is that, well, in U.S. terms, he's called a charismatic politician. Am I right?
Yes.
Highly personable and popular.
He's the son of a congregational minister, and he used to be pretty wild when he was young. He nearly killed himself on a motorbike when he was 17. And when he was sort of recovering from this accident, he decided to live life to the full. He became a Rhodes Scholar, head of our trade union movement, and then went into Parliament about 2 years ago, and just before the elections were held last year, he became Prime Minister. He's been in office 14 months, and he's got 74% public support. He was asked on TV whether he was worried about the other 26% who weren't supporting him. He said he was, but he was working on them and hoped to get somewhere with that. And basically, his idea, or he is a social democrat, his idea is to encourage the private sector to get the economy working again, and from that hope that the benefits spread out into the community, particularly not only creating more jobs but providing more money for the government to take care of those who are disadvantaged. But also he wants to modernize our economy we're very efficient in mining, we're very efficient in agriculture, but we've got a lot of problems in our industry, partly because we're few in number. One of the things he hopes to do is to modernise Australian industry and make it more competitive. And also we've had a kind of problem that you've had here with unemployment. We're a bit below 10% now, but one of the ways the government hopes to overcome this is encouraging more tourism. There are all sorts of indicators that the growth in employment is going to be in service industries.
His election, the election of a social democrat, a former trade union leader, that represents a fairly substantial break with recent Australian political history, does it not?
It's true. Since 1949 we've had conservative governments continually. Mr. Whitlam was Prime Minister for about 4 years, I think, from 72 to 75 rather, and this is the second Social Democratic government since then, and it's been in office for 14 months.
Most Americans, it would seem to me, would regard Australia with a certain degree of fondness, consider the country to be a long-time close friend of the United States, but maybe somewhat take that relationship for granted. Is that fair to say?
You've sort of highlighted, I think, a very basic problem, and one I don't know the answer to, because living here I recognise that American people have terrific problems of their own. After all, you are a superpower, you're the world's leading country, getting the economy moving, and I don't think it's so much a question of taking us for granted, but it's more a question of, on our part, of making you realise the contribution that we make. Certainly we benefit from our relationship with the United States, but equally well the United States benefits from your relationship with us.
Give me a for instance as to how we might underestimate the importance of that relationship.
You said that we underestimated the...
I say that we do underestimate the importance of it.
I can't give you a practical example. It's mentioned occasionally. For example, our foreign minister would say we do not wish the United States to take us for granted, but I can't think of a specific example, except when the United States took action against that pipeline in Europe, you remember the gas pipeline, sure. Because of the extraordinary way the United States wrote the regulations, it made construction stop on one of our pipelines, and it took a tremendous amount of effort to resolve this problem. So that is one example where I guess we thought we were taken for granted, or the implementation of that particular feature had a lot of bad aspects. And then from memory too, when the Russians went into Afghanistan, all sorts of action was taken against them, and then I think suddenly you decided to resume grain supplies to the Soviet Union at a pretty short notice. So maybe they're the sort of examples, but in terms of major problems, at the present time I certainly can't think of any. And as I say, I think about this aspect a lot, and I feel that it's up to us to make Americans aware, you know, of just how valuable we are.
Let me ask you for a little more specific evaluation of some of, I guess, the trouble spots or the points of tension in some way in East Asia, particularly. President Reagan just returned from a much celebrated trip to China, with, I think it's fair to say, the main goal being some strategic, not agreements, but some way of using the Chinese in a way to balance off Soviet expansion in that part of the world. I guess my question would be, does that seem like sound American policy, and are the Chinese likely to be dependable in that regard?
On the first question, to me it seems very sound policy, and the prospects of the Pacific look better now than they have for a long time, and part of this is because there's a good relationship between the United States, Japan and China. I think it's a good policy. Also, the communist insurrections in Thailand and Malaysia have eased off in recent years. There are a few potential problems. There are obvious difficulties in the Philippines, but by and large, the region looks better now than it has for 10 years at least. One of the jobs I had overseas was in Korea, and when I was there in 60-61, there was tremendous political instability, and the economy is flat as a pancake. I never dreamt that the Koreans could develop their economy as they have. When I was there, their exports were perhaps about $60 million a year. Now they're 20 billion. So I think the policy of the West in Asia, by and large, has been most successful. Obviously, there are a few points of difficulty, but by and large, it's one on the up and up. Now, your other question was?
Was whether in developing this new relationship with the Chinese, whether they're likely, through this, I guess, the stability of their government, are they likely to be dependable in terms of advancing that relationship?
Yeah, well, it's not appropriate for me to comment on whether they are dependable or not. We didn't recognize or establish diplomatic relations with Peking until after Dr. Kissinger went there, but virtually throughout the whole of that period, we traded with them because we were a supplier of wheat, and this is a good, inexpensive food. We've had a very happy relationship with the Chinese since then. We even have a little aid program where we train their people, and every Australian Prime Minister, since the time we established diplomatic mission, goes up to China and has worthwhile talks with them.
So they are dependable trading partners, at least,
Sure,
and have been for the Australians.
And also, you could argue that there was a big misinterpretation or misevaluation on our side, because we used to look at the communist bloc as being a monolith, and it wasn't until the split had taken place some time after that that we realized what had happened. Who knows about the future of China? As I say, I have no first-hand knowledge on how developments will turn out that way.
We're in the throes in this country of some considerable debate about, well, it's manifesting itself in terms of automobile imports from Japan, and whether we should basically convince the Japanese to continue to limit those imports. Do you have similar sorts of problems in dealing with the Japanese, for example?
Well, Japan is our biggest export market. The United States is our biggest supplier of imports. And we have 4 motor car manufacturers, and that's too many for a population our size. And the Prime Minister says that there is a need to rationalize and modernize the industry, but basically there are 2 Japanese and 2 American. And we suffer in a kind of way I suppose you're suffering, and the price of Australian motor cars is too high because our labour costs are high, our production runs are small, and this industry has to have a degree of protection. We have a comparable situation to the one you have here, where the local industry is protected, but some imports are allowed in. And various schemes have been tried to resolve this problem, but so far none of them have been successful in helping the consumer.
It's frequently argued that the Japanese talk a good game of free trading, but that they don't practice it. Is that fair?
Well, our exports are basically raw materials, but every Prime Minister and every Minister for Trade gets in there pushing, to make sure we get our share. And feelings against Japan were very strong immediately after the war, but once we entered into this trade agreement, not only were we a reliable supplier, but we went out of our way to be as friendly and as helpful to the Japanese. We have, as do you, of course, regular meetings with them, and they take a lot of trouble in terms of their foreign ministry. For example, the present Japanese ambassador to the United States, his last job was in Canberra. The present Japanese ambassador to the United Nations, his last job was in Canberra. And the present Japanese ambassador in Canberra, he was the number 2 official in the Japanese foreign ministry. So clearly they see us of some importance, at least in terms of links with the countries around us in Asia and also the Pacific, and they do send some of their best people to us.
You mentioned the Philippines, which has become, in some way, an increasing concern of the United States. Are you worried for the future of the Philippines? I guess most people think that President Marcos is in some trouble in some way, and virtually anything is possible there, from a military coup d'etat to civil war to Marcos continuing to rule for a long time yet.
Yeah, well, we have to be very careful in what we say. If you start talking about civil war or military uprising, maybe that sort of thing, that sort of talk triggers it out.
I understand what you're saying.
Yes, but we can't influence the outcome of what happens in the Philippines. And we have sort of been very good friends with the Philippines. There are a number of Filipino people who are settled in Australia. And I was in the Navy myself, and the ship I was in was part of the American Navy, and we were in the landings that retook the Philippines. But Australia can't affect that outcome except in a very sort of friendly, perhaps friendly advisory way. And also, we just wish the Filipino people well. But if you look back over the history of Southeast Asia, and I don't wish to be too Pollyanna, quite often these difficult situations do get resolved by the people themselves. I mean, look back to Indonesia when Dr. Sukarno was there, and look at the situation as it is today. So we live in hopes. And as I say, we look back at modern history, the story in the Southeast Asia is a positive one.
Let me ask you at least one other subject in the security arena. The United States, there's been some pressure in the United States to call upon the Japanese to make larger expenditures for defense, not only their own, but presumably the collective defense of that part of the world. Is that a good policy, and should they be doing more in that area?
Well, there's an Australian play about an American which says the truth has more than 1,000 faces, and I heard this very problem discussed by Secretary Weinberger recently, and the way he spoke about it was that the Japanese had agreed in principle that they ought to be able to defend their own supply lines for 1,000 miles, but the problem was one of timing. Some people on the American side thought they ought to do it a bit quicker than the Japanese were prepared to go. And our government, or at least our foreign minister, did make a statement to the effect he didn't think that the Japanese should be rushed along. And then you've also got statements by Dr. Kissinger on your side, who has some reservations about encouraging the Japanese to go into their own, building up their defense forces beyond a certain point.
Well, I think it's safe to say that there are a number of countries in the Pacific Rim that are concerned about that prospect, a rearmed Japan, if you will. Australia have any of those concerns?
Well, no, because it hasn't happened, and it's a hypothetical question, and it'd be very delicate, you know, when a situation. I mean, it's certainly not a problem at the present time.
In the area of trade, this state, in this part of the country in particular, has spent a good deal of effort in developing markets in Asia, in the Pacific Rim countries. Idaho is certainly interested in exports to that part of the world, but it occurs to me that most of the things we have to export from this state are most of the things that you have to export from Australia. Am I right?
To a point. I think that in terms of beef, the quality of our beef is quite different to yours. And sugar is another item which we export a lot. The emphasis in our exports to Asia are the sort of the bulk products, whereas in your case it would be the fruit, vegetables, high quality beef and items like that, I think, wouldn't it?
Right, and I guess I was thinking more in terms of raw materials, certain other agricultural products.
Well, can I answer you in a general way? The United States traditionally has had a very favourable balance of trade with Australia, 2-to-1 in your favour. And the range of our exports to you is very limited. It's basically beef, sugar, wool, items like that. Our big dream is every American would wear one more woolen sock. and that really would give our economy a big lift. And any restrictions on our capacity to exports to the United States sort of really hurts and puts us in a very difficult situation. And some of the things we buy from you, for example, on the 21st of July, we're taking delivery of a frigate from Todd Shipyard in Seattle. That's the 4th frigate we've bought there, $300 million each. And when we buy from you, we pay cash, and Todd Shipyard are going to help us to build 2 in Australia. There's an order in for about $860 million worth of Boeings up at Boeings in Everett, and over the next 5 years we're going to buy at least $4 billion worth of defence equipment. And a lot of the things too we buy in the non-military side are machinery. Now it's argued, the governor of California says every $1 billion worth of exports generates 50,000 jobs, and other people say it generates 25,000 jobs. But the American exports to Australia are quite significant, and as I say, in terms of trying to pay you back, not that we're arguing that the trade should be balanced, we have the short end of the stick.
Do you have the short end of the stick because in some way we are making it difficult for you to trade openly with us?
No, I mean, and when we do, we certainly let you know. But what I'm trying to say is I would hope that nothing will be done to impede, our exports to. Yeah, certainly this sort of bizarre bargaining goes on, about how much meat should be supplied. And naturally, the more we can supply, the better. But what I'm trying to say is I would hope, on future occasions, nothing would be done to upset our suppliers to you, given the fact that we are such a good traditional customer of yours.
There was some controversy, as I recall, over the wheat sales, particularly when we embargoed our wheat sales to the Soviet Union following the invasion of Afghanistan, and I think the Australian government was criticized, or Australia was criticized for filling some of that demand.
No, I'm only relying on my memory, which is very shaky. We didn't do that. We didn't increase our sales. And then suddenly you changed your mind from memory and resumed the sales. I've heard that point before, and to my memory, that is wrong. We didn't do that.
So what problem did that cause you in terms of us making such a quick change in policy?
Well, because we've been holding back, and and I think we were left behind, because of that.
You could, in other words, you could have stepped in and made.
Yes,
and
but my
picked up
understanding is we didn't.
I see.
No.
Okay. Also, the cattle imports at times have been criticized. Am I right?
Well, I have no first-hand knowledge. If you say this is so, it must be so. But my answer to that is the point I made to you before. You have an incredibly favourable balance of trade with us, which I hope continues. We are very limited in what we can sell you, so I hope nothing is done to impede that.
Let me ask you about one other controversy. There was a fairly popular book written a couple of years ago about a celebrated American spy named Christopher
yes.
Boyce, who spent some time, among other places, in the northern part of this state. One of the revelations, if it turned out to be true in the book about him, was the controversy over the satellite and radar stations in Australia and your government's concern about how the United States basically was using those facilities. Has that concern been mollified?
The concern has been mollified. The Prime Minister was asked this very question when he was out here last year. And he said as far as the US installations, which are very important ones in Australia, were concerned, of course they increase the risk of attack on Australia. But as an ally, we were expected to make a contribution to pull our way. That was one point. And the second point, these installations are very helpful in knowing what's going on. They're part of the surveillance activities, and consequently they have a deterrence effect. If we didn't have them, we might know what's going on, and then people might get upset unnecessarily. So for those reasons, he supported their presence in Australia. Now the other thing that another question that I'm sometimes asked is about Boyce. He alleged that, or somebody alleged that the CIA was involved in somehow or other in the downfall of the previous Labor government. Well, Mr. Hawke discussed this fully with Senator Moynihan, who put a tremendous amount of effort into it, and Senator Moynihan said that there was no evidence of this, and Mr. Hawke accepted the position of Senator Moynihan.
I think the point that the book about Boyce made, however, was that essentially the United States government, at least at best, had misled your government about the purpose of those radar stations.
I haven't read Boyce's. I tried to read his book, or I've read books about him. I haven't read his own particular. That was the Birdman, wasn't it? The book you're talking about? Or that's
Falcon in the Snowman.
Falcon and the Snowman. I go along with what the Prime Minister says. I mean, how do you prove or disprove? I mean, this sort of accusation or comment keeps on popping up from time to time, and I stand by what the Prime Minister says.
Fair enough. Let me finally ask you, your job, in essence, this is your first time in our state, right?
Correct, yes.
Is, well, I guess you're on a goodwill mission, in effect, are you?
Yes. Well, there's two things. I came to learn what I could about Idaho, and the second point is to tell people a bit about Australia. We think our relationship is terrifically important. We value the US relationship, and we want you to. This is a point I made earlier. I have this sort of wonderful consular area which takes in the whole of the northwest, and it's essentially a goodwill mission, a mission to, in effect, sell Australia, although we don't have anything that we necessarily want you to buy except good feelings towards us. We, for many years, were able to trade on the fact that a lot of American soldiers married Australian girls when they were in Australia, but they're now my age or older, so we've got to, you know, work away at keeping our image and good relationships alive.
I understand. Well, you're trading well in terms of your motion pictures, which have been very popular here, too.
Yes. Well, I mean, they're not only good for their own sake, but also they've generated quite a lot of interest in Australia. So we hope that the Australian film industry keeps on churning out some good ones. We've had our fair share of duds too, let me say.
Well, perhaps it's the very best that reached the United States, and we're happy about that. It's very good to talk to you. We appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
That interview with Australian Consul General John Melvish was taped on May 9th. 2 days ago, Idaho voters chose Gary Hart over Walter Mondale by a I'm just going to go again. That interview with Australian Consul General John Melvish was taped on May 9th. 2 days ago, Idaho voters chose Gary Hart over Walter Mondale by a 2-to-1 margin. But Hart's supporters are going to have to turn out at tonight's party caucuses if he's going to get any delegates. We'll be there tonight, and we'll have a report tomorrow on that controversial part of selecting a president, the party caucus. That's all for tonight. I'm Jean McNeil. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.